My clock says 6 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Find Your Ancestors session today. I'm Katie Stilp. I'm the local history librarian here at Appleton Public Library in Appleton, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar on breathing new life into your boring ancestors. Before we dive into tonight's program, I do have a couple quick announcements. First, a huge thank you to the Friends of the Appleton Public Library for providing funding for our Find Your Ancestors series and allowing us to continue bringing amazing speakers every month. We definitely couldn't do this without their support. For those unfamiliar, the Find Your Ancestors series happens once a month, every month of the year. So definitely check out the handout. On the first page, you'll be able to see some information on our upcoming programs with links to register for them. Since we're in summer, our sessions happen Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. Central. So our July session, we're actually going to have two Find Your Ancestors sessions. The first one's going to be on homestead records on July 13th with Christine Cohen. And then we're going to do a bonus session on July 27th, also a Thursday, on family search, where I'm going to be your presenter and I'm going to give you a really guided tour and a deep dive into using a lot of the popular features of the site and maybe even some features that you're not aware of on that site. Then we'll wrap up the summer sessions on August 10th with Mary Riso, who's going to be discussing how to research the genealogy of your neighborhood to try and locate some more information on your ancestors. So again, take a look at the handout. I'll post that a few times throughout our session today if you miss it, and there's going to be registration links on that first page of the handout. There's also a link to the events calendar on the handout, or you can go to apl.org and go to our events calendar to check out the remainder dates and topics for all of our sessions for the remainder of the year. Just a reminder, even if you register for any of those upcoming programs today, you are going to get an email a week before, a day before, and an hour before the programs with a reminder and information on joining those programs. If you missed any of our past Find Your Ancestors sessions, definitely check out our YouTube channel. There's a link to that in the handout. Of course, not every presentation is recorded or up there indefinitely, so be sure you're registering and attending live if you're able to. We are recording today's session and are sent a link to that recording hopefully tomorrow. A reminder that recording or capturing this presentation in any format without permission from our speaker and the library is prohibited. All the slides and handout materials are covered by copyright law. You are welcome to download and/or print a copy of the handout for your personal use, but no portion of any material may be photographed, duplicated, or shared in any way without permission from our speaker. I have closed captioning enabled. If you need it, you're able to push that button at the bottom of your screen. Just be aware it's not 100% live transcript or it's not 100% accurate since it is a live transcript. If you need any other accommodations to enjoy tonight's presentation, just let me know in the chat. If you have any questions during today's session, you can use the Q&A box that's located on the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer questions at the end. For any library-specific questions, or if you need help navigating any of our library's genealogy databases, definitely feel free to reach out to me. My email address is in the handout. I also offer one-on-one sessions via Zoom or in person at the library to help with the genealogy questions that you might have or show you some of our genealogy databases. So if you're interested in those, feel free to take a look at the handout and send me an email, or there's a link in the handout to book an appointment with me. Then finally, at the end of today's presentation, there's a short survey from Project Outcome, which is an American Library Association sponsored initiative. If you could just take a minute to fill it out and let us know what you thought of tonight's presentation, we would greatly appreciate it. There's also a spot on the survey to let us know what topics you'd like us to tackle in the future for Find Your Ancestors. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Today we have Melissa Barker. She's a certified archives manager and public historian, currently working at the Houston County, Tennessee Archives. She is affectionately known as the Archive Lady to the genealogy community. She lectures, teaches, and writes about the genealogy research process, researching in archives and records preservation. She conducts virtual presentations across the United States and other countries for various genealogy groups and societies. She also writes a popular blog titled A Genealogist in the Archives and is a well-known published book reviewer. She has been a professional genealogist for the past 19 years with expertise in Tennessee records and has been researching her own family history for the past 33 years. So welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Katie, so much. I'm so glad to be here and talking about Boring ancestors. Hopefully none of you have boring ancestors, but I've had genealogists tell me that before, that they had boring ancestors, or they had an ancestor that was boring, that they didn't like to research them because they were just so boring. I can tell you I don't have any boring ancestors because I believe that every single one of our ancestors who've lived on this earth have a story to tell. And that story to tell is interesting, but sometimes we think they're boring because we can't find any records or we're not using the right methodology. So hopefully this presentation is going to make you take another look at those ancestors that you think are boring. So do you think you have boring ancestors? When you think of your ancestors, do you think that they look like this when they were living? This is actually my great-great-grandmother on her honeymoon with her second husband from 1915. This is a picture postcard. And as you can see, they were so thrilled to be on their honeymoon. Now, some of us that know photography know that they told them not to smile, but these two look like they're kind of miserable, even though they're on their honeymoon. They were in their honeymoon at Put-in Bay in Ohio. My ancestors are all from Ohio. But what makes this postcard even more funny to me is that on the back, what they wrote was, I am on the wings of love. They don't look like they're on the wings of love. But this is what I'm talking about when I think genealogists think of boring ancestors. So are some of the statements that I've heard genealogists say that they think they have boring ancestors is they say, I have the birth, marriage, and death records for my ancestors. What else is there? Well, I can tell you there's a lot more. Or I've heard them say, my ancestors were poor dirt farmers. They didn't do anything exciting during their lives. Katie mentioned that some of her ancestors were dirt farmers, and I have some of those in my ancestry as well. Let me tell you something. They did not live in a vacuum. They did not stay in their cabin on their farm and never ventured out. And so there are records out there. Maybe you've said to yourself, I have found all the records for my ancestors. I'm done with my genealogy. I have been doing this for 33 years. So many of you probably have been doing it longer than I have. I will never be done with my genealogy research. There is so much more to discover and to find about our ancestors. And some of you have said, I can't find any records for my ancestors. I've looked everywhere. Well, this may be true for certain periods of time, but as time passes, more records become available. I'm an archivist. I work in archives every day, and I can tell you that there are records that are being found in attics, in basements, in garages, and outbuildings, in abandoned buildings, and they're brought to archives. And so when you say you've looked everywhere, well, that's probably true for that time. Give it a year and then check back with those archives and those libraries and all those places where there are records, because there are records being donated, discovered, and found all the time. None of us have boring ancestors, and I really hope that after this presentation that you take a second, even a third look at some of the ones that you've kind of put aside, thinking, well, they're not that interesting. I'm going to research just the interesting ones. So here are some answers to those questions or those statements that I just talked about. Documenting the birth, marriage, and death records of our ancestors is important, but it's not enough to build a life story. And here in just a minute, I'm going to show you a method that I use to build a life story. Those poor dirt farmers, they could have lots of records. They interacted with the community. Maybe they were part of the local church. Maybe their children went to school. If they're farmers, maybe they own their property, so that there are property records, tax records. When they died, there may be probate records. I could go on and on and on. We should look at every single record source as a potential to have our ancestors in them. Just because they are farmers does not mean that they did not get involved. As far as records, there is a statistic runs around out there that only 5% of the world's genealogical records are online. My personal opinion as an archivist and as a genealogist is that it's actually less than 5%. We have so many archives out there, and when you look at what they have in their buildings and what's online, there is really so much more sitting in their buildings than there is online. Archives are full of records you don't even know exist. And I had this conversation with Katie before we started that, many people say, I can't travel. And I understand that. I get that. I live in Tennessee. All of my ancestors are from West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland. I've worked full-time my entire adult life, so I don't get to travel very much, if much at all. So I have done those 33 years of research from a distance, and I have been extremely successful. There are going to be a couple of records collections that I will probably have to go and actually look at because they will probably never be digitized, never be available in such a way that I can gain access to them. But for the most part, I've been very successful with my research. It just takes a lot of patience and it takes a lot of stick-to-itiveness. So let's talk about archives. Archives are my passion because that's where the records are. This is probably a crazy question because many of you know what archives are, but I like to talk about these because inevitably I'll have someone say, I didn't think about that place being an archive. So the Society of American Archivists defines an archive as an organization that collects the records of individuals, families, and other organizations. A very broad definition. Essentially, any building that collects and preserves records and makes them available to the public is an archive. It may not have the word archive in their name or the word archive on their building, but if they have records, they're processing them, they're preserving them, and making them available to researchers, they are an archive. So archives are everywhere, and there is an archive for everything. So let's talk about some different kinds of archives. County archives. This is where I work. I work in a county archives, and we do a lot there. For the most part, we manage county government records, and you can find your ancestors in many of these county government records. Many of our county archives also collect and preserve local and historical and genealogical records, but not all of them. Many of our county archives stick to just the government records, but don't discount that because those government records are things like tax records, property records, court records, things like that. So we always need to look at those records. Many times these county archives are funded by the county government, or they are all run by volunteers and receive donations. And these particular archives should not be confused with any other local archive. I find sometimes genealogists will go to one archive in an area where they're researching and they think they've accessed all the records that there are, when there could be other archives in the vicinity that you should be looking at. So always look for every single repository in a place that you're researching and check all of those records. Historical and genealogical societies, they are also a type of archive. If they have a building with records in them, preserving them, making them available to researchers, they are an archive. And the Historical and Genealogical Society members are a true treasure trove of information. If they were born and lived there their whole lives, their families have been there for 6 generations, they are great people to talk to. So some areas have one of these societies or both of these societies. And I've also seen sometimes where they put them together and they have a historical genealogical society. They collect and preserve historical records. They are really in some of the historical societies mainly focus on the history of the area, where genealogical societies will focus on the genealogical aspect of the people who live there. Members can be very knowledgeable about local history and where the records are located. Not only can they help you with the local history, local genealogical information on families, but I guarantee you, if you ask them, where are these records located? They're going to tell you, whether that's in a courthouse ready for you to do research, or they're in an abandoned building somewhere that nobody is doing anything with. They're going to know where they're located. Many of these organizations accept donations of records, photographs, and artifacts from the public. Many of our historical and genealogical societies have things walk into their buildings by individuals and get donated every day. So that's why we're never done with our research. This is an example of a genealogical society. This is the Germantown Regional History and Genealogy Center. This is where the Tennessee Genealogical Society houses their records. I'm actually on their board of directors. And so a great place to find some records for that particular area. This is just outside of Memphis. Local libraries. If you've ever thought about the local library itself being a type of archive. Many of our local libraries have records, whether those are published genealogical reference books, published family histories that are sitting on their shelves. But some of our libraries have genealogy rooms that are filled with microfilmed records. They have family files. They have other kinds of genealogical records, or maybe they have what are called special collections. These are a collection of records like diaries and scrapbooks, old family letters, things like that. So do not discount the local public library. And also, I always like to tell people about local public libraries. A lot of times these have also purchased or paid for databases and make them available to their card holders, such as Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, Find My Past, Newspapers.com. So check with the local libraries in your area. Actually, there's no local library in my area that offers this that I can access from home. So I found a local library in my same state, but not near me, that I was able to get a library card, and I can access those databases from home. So look for that. So many of our local libraries have genealogy rooms or genealogical records collections. They could have those special collections like I talked about. Reference materials that are genealogy related could be in there. They can also have the microfilmed records. Don't forget those. There's lots of things on microfilm that have not even been digitized and available online yet. They could have family histories and also local historical materials to help you tell your family's history. State archives. These are what I call mega archives. Every U.S. state has a state archives. They may not be called the state archives. I think a few of them are called historical centers, but every state has one. And every state historical archives have a website. So whatever state you're researching in, you should be accessing the records at the state archives. Now, just because they're located at the state capital or one of the larger cities and not near where your ancestors lived, doesn't mean there's not records in those facilities for you about your ancestors. They try to collect records from across their state, including local county records could be there. So I'll explain that in a minute. I have two red arrows here because this is my home away from home. This is the Tennessee State Library and Archives. It's about an hour and a half due east of me. This photograph is from about 1953, not too long after this building was built. This is also where I went back to school to become an archivist. And as I was attending the Archives Institute, they were asked us one day, would you like to have a tour of the Tennessee Supreme Court records, the original records? We said, yes, we would love to. So we got in an elevator, went to this top floor, got out of the elevator, and I mean, we just stepped off the elevator, and as far as our eyes could see was nothing but shelves full of boxes, which composed the Tennessee Supreme Court records dating back to 1796. So this is an ongoing project. If you have ancestors in Tennessee and you think they may or may have been have a Supreme Court case of any kind, go to the TSLA website. As they process these records, they're putting the index online. If you find something, you can actually request the records and have them mailed to you. So a fantastic, fantastic place to do research. We're very lucky that a year and a half ago, they actually opened the doors on a brand new facility. This is their brand new facility in Nashville, Tennessee. Fantastic place to find records. So state archives. They are mega archives. They contain records from across the state. They archive the state government records, just like county archives do the local county government records. They also archive the state government records. They could also have all the county records, government records in their archives. And why would they be there? Because many of our county governments didn't have an archive locally, and they had no place to put their records. So many times they were shipped to the state archives. So a great place to find local records that you can't find locally. Many of our state archives also collect genealogical records, historical records, photographs, artifacts, things like that. Always go to the state archives. This is also where records conservation and preservation takes place. If you have a question about how to preserve something like a damaged photograph, a torn document, a rolled up photograph, contact your state archives where you live. They have conservationists and conservators on staff. Now, they may or may not be able to help you because many times if their paycheck comes from the state, they can't do that kind of work with individuals. They can give you advice, they can answer your questions, and they can also give you a name and phone number of someone who works independently that you can hire if you need to hire someone. Colleges and university library and archives. I find genealogists overlook these. They are everywhere. Almost all of our colleges and universities have libraries and archives, or one or the other, on their campuses. And many of them have more than one. They are a treasure trove for genealogists, and we should be using them. This is actually a photograph of the Pogue Library at Murray State University, just over the border in Kentucky from Tennessee. And these archives and libraries have local historical records. They have genealogical records, because just like state archives, there probably was a time when there were no other local archives. And so individuals donated their records to the college or university. Many alumni will donate what are called their papers, meaning their correspondence, whatever papers they did professionally, to their alumni. So even if your ancestor didn't go to college, you may find records for them at a local college or university. Just from the sheer fact that they lived in the area, nobody else would take them, and so they got donated to a college or university. So we need to use these to our advantage. Of course, they're going to have the college administrative records, student records. So if you do have an ancestor that went to college, check to see if they have records for them. I was able to get my husband's great uncle's medical records from when he went to medical school to become a doctor at Vanderbilt University from the 1800s. So a lot of these places have those records. They could have historical records, genealogical records, diaries, scrapbooks. There is a state college not too far from me called Austin Peay State University. And at that university, in their archives, they have diaries. And there's one of their college history professors has written 3 books from 3 of those diaries. They are all Civil War era related, written by women. And she's published those books. So these records exist, and we should be looking for them. So they have libraries and archives located on their campuses, and most of the time I've been able to gain access to those campuses and to those libraries and archives with no problem. And they also, just like any other archive, will receive donations of historical and genealogical records all the time. So check back with them often. Museums. Museums are also a type of archive. I actually came to the idea of using museums as a research place quite late in my research career, but they do. If you think about it, if you go to a museum and you walk through the exhibits and displays like this one, and if you see an old letter on display, a photograph, a scrapbook, a diary, I guarantee you there's more where that came from in the back rooms. This is actually one of my favorite archives and museums. Is the Williamson County, Tennessee Museum and Archives. I love this display. They have fantastic exhibits and displays, but they're also an archive. So museums will have those exhibits and displays. I like to say museums have a front room and a back room. Of course, the front room is the pretty place where they have all the exhibits and displays, all on display and exhibit for us to see. But just like any other archive, they have a back room. And in that back room are shelves full of boxes with records. So they can contain archived records in those back rooms, genealogical records, historical records. The only thing I would mention about museums is that they may be a little more of a challenge to gain access to their stored records. Museum curators are actually a little more even protective of, as archivists are. Archivists are pretty protective of their records, but museum curators seem to be a little more protective. But the way I work this is that I contact them, I email them, I call them, I talk to them about my research, not the 3-hour speech, very brief. Ask them what they might have that can help me if they have something of interest. I work with them. I set up an appointment. I ask if I can come see those records, show them how serious I am about my research. And then I've only been refused once, and it was something very rare and very delicate. But you have to lay that groundwork first. You can't just show up on their doorstep and say, hey, I want to see these records. It's going to take some time and patience. Church archives. Many of us want to research our ancestors' church affiliation, the church history, and you can do that because there are church archives out there. This is actually an example of one. This is the historical foundation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in America archive. It's in Cordova, Tennessee, just outside of Memphis. Susan Knight Gore is actually a friend of mine, a fellow archivist, and they archive the Cumberland Presbyterian Church records. Now, before you say to yourself, but I don't have any Tennessee ancestors, so this wouldn't help me because it's in Tennessee. They travel from state to state, city to city, church to church, picking up records from any Cumberland Presbyterian Church and then bringing them back to the archive. And there are many of these denominational or church affiliate type archives out there. So if we're researching, obviously we want to check with the church itself, and if they don't have the records there locally, seek out one of these types of archives that are mainly organized by denomination or church affiliation. Another great archive, which is a church archive, is the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives. It's located in downtown Nashville. They have records from different states, different cities concerning the Southern Baptists. And so look at what kind of religion, what kind of denomination your ancestors were affiliated with, were members of. Check the local church first, and then look for these larger archives. You might be quite surprised. They're usually organized by denomination or type of religion. Their archive records from the local church are at one facility. Many times these local churches will send their old records to these types of facilities. And again, don't forget that sometimes the individual churches have their own records still in their offices. And don't be surprised if a pastor or a church leader, a Sunday school teacher, took some of the records home. And I realized this one day a few years ago when we had a collection of records donated to my archive by the family of Lola and Laura Knight, who were twin sisters, who were educators in our community for decades. And amongst their records were school registers, which were fantastic, but also there was a Sunday school register from the local Methodist church where they were the Sunday school teachers, and they kept attendance, they kept membership, things like that. So it was a great find, but many times these records get taken home, so hopefully they'll get donated. Regional archives. These are also fantastic types of archives to look into. This is a great one. This is the Archives of the Appalachia. It's located at the East Tennessee State University, and they were going to give you information on a particular region. If you're researching your ancestor, you want more than that birth, marriage, and death date. So you want to research their region. Where did they live? Where did they grow up? What kind of culture did they grow up in? What kind of things did they learn or grow up with that they carried with them and handed down generation to generation? So these types of archives will highlight the particular culture of that region. They could encompass more than one state within the region. Just like the Appalachian region, we know the Appalachian region is Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia. It's more than one state. And it's a great place to learn how your ancestors lived. You may not find specific records that name your specific ancestor, but I love learning about the areas and the regions where my ancestors lived. What were unique about those regions? What did they experience in those regions? So a great place to find those kinds of information. And lastly, ethnic archives. We have many of these across the United States and across the world, in Europe and in Canada. This is a great example of that. This is the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina. If you think you have Cherokee ancestry, a great place to learn about these particular peoples. I would say one of our newest, which is really, it opened just before COVID, Ethnic Archives is the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. I've not had the privilege yet to go visit this archive, but I understand it is absolutely phenomenal. So if you have African American history or African American ancestors, a great place to learn about the culture, about the people, what they experienced, and how they persevered. Great place. Ethnic archives, just like any other archive, they're going to collect and archive records for a particular race of people. They will concentrate normally on the history, culture, and the lives of a particular ethnic group. And they are fantastic learning centers for the diverse groups of people that make up our ancestry. And so look for these types of archives as well. So now I'm going to show you some great genealogy that I have done on one of my husband's ancestors to bring him to life, okay? I actually can see the people that I research jump off the page at me and come to life right in front of my eyes when I do this. There are all kinds of methods that you can use. Don't just take what I'm going to show you, and if it doesn't work for you, find another method. But this is what works for me. I'm a visual learner. I have to see it. I have to do it. I have to feel it, touch it. And this helps me. So this is the method that I use to bring my ancestors to life, and that is timelines. Many of you that use timelines, you know what I'm talking about. They are a great visual. And when we get to the end of this presentation, you're going to see a person you've never met before, hopefully come to life right before your eyes. So what is a timeline? Very easy. A timeline is a listing of life events arranged usually in chronological order. Very simple, very easy. You don't need any special programs. You don't need any special anything. I just use a Word document. You can even use pencil and paper if you want to. But timelines are really a good source for me, a good tactic that I use. A timeline usually starts with the birth of the person and ends with their death. Now, I put in parentheses some exceptions. There are things that may happen that necessarily doesn't involve your ancestor, but it might. That may come after their death, such as their probate. That happens after their death, their last will and testament when it's probated, their estate, when their estate sales, when all that kind of stuff happens after their death. And so you might want to include that. They should also include, of course, the vital information, such as the birth, marriage, and death dates. That's kind of a no-brainer. That is a staple in pretty much every timeline. But a timeline could also include any event in a person's life. And I include every single thing I find on my ancestors on my timelines. Also, if you want to, you don't have to, you can include historical events in the timeline, such as something that happened locally or something that happened at the state level, something that happened at the national level, or even something that happened the world level, such as a war, like World War II, the Great Depression, the 1918 flu epidemic. So things like that you can include on their timeline. And that actually will help you, maybe even to understand why your ancestors did what they did, or why they moved to where they moved to, things like that. So including those historical events may help you understand their lives a little better. So I'm going to show you how I bring one of my ancestors to life. And what I'm going to use is Jesse Glasgow. Jesse Glasgow is my husband's third great-grandfather. He is a fascinating person. I talk about people saying they have boring ancestors. I have favorite ancestors. I know you're not supposed to play favorites with your ancestors, but I do. And he is one of my favorite ancestors to research. So here is a very basic, and I put boring, but boring, basic timeline for him. It gives his year of birth and it gives his year of death. And in between, I have all of the census records that I could find him in. And there are still a couple missing that I can't find him in. And this is the basic timeline. Now, I will tell you, this is what I do when it comes to timelines. I will make a Word document, put the person's name at the top, and then I will list their birth year and their death year and every single year in between. I want to find a piece of information for every single year they have been on this earth. Now, I don't have not one timeline completed. So that tells you I still have a lot of work to do. So this is his basic timeline. And now we're going to talk about a lot of records having to do with him. And as we do that, I want you to pay attention as I show you his timeline over and over, how full it gets, how more interesting he gets, and how much he's not boring. So between the census, I don't know about you, but those can be hard times to do research. The census was recorded every 10 years since 1790. And those 10 years, a lot can happen in those 10 years in your ancestor's life. So here's the 1840 Davidson County, Tennessee. That's where Nashville is, for Jesse Glasgow. He is listed. I have him with an arrow there. And of course, if anybody knows, looking at a 1940s or an 1840 census, that only lists the head of household and then every other person in the household by what are called tick marks. They're not listed every person until 1850. So here he is. The 1840 census has 2 pages, but for this presentation, I'm only showing you one. So here he is in the 1840 census. A lot can happen in 10 years. I have found children who were born and died in those 10 years, but I found their information in other records. And I never would have known that if I had just pulled census records and not looked at anything else. People marry and get divorced in 10 years. There's a lot that can happen in 10 years. So there are numerous record sources that can be consulted to help you cover those 10 years in between the census. And that's kind of what we're wanting to do. A timeline, when I do a timeline and I sit and I study that timeline, it really helps me to see the gaps in my ancestors' research that I'm missing. And then I can make my to-do list of what I want to do, my research list, and I can start doing research. So timelines really help me with that. So what kinds of records should I be looking for? Well, tax records. Tax records are actually one of those kinds of records that if they're in the tax records, you can actually document somebody every single year because they have to pay their taxes every year. So in this case, this is a tax receipt. This is where Jesse Glasgow paid his taxes in 1885 for his 1884 taxes. And it is an actual receipt. Many times these get thrown away, but this was saved. And I can put this on his timeline. So tax records are a fantastic place to look for your ancestors. Property records. Now, not all of our ancestors own property. While this is my husband's third great grandfather on his father's side, and my husband's third great grandfather on his father's side never owned a piece of property in his life. However, I have found him in property records doing other kinds of instruments. So property records, you can look for these during that 10-year span of time in between the census, because they could have purchased property in between those censuses. In fact, they could purchase property and sell property, and if you didn't check the property records, you would never know it because it didn't show up on a census record. So here's a deed for Jesse Glasgow, dated March the 10th, 1881, where he is purchasing property from J.S. Lee. And so I have this record. And the normal records we look for, the birth, marriage, and death records. Again, we can find maybe, possibly, numerous instances of births, marriages, and deaths in those 10 years in between the census. Again, many children were born and died in between those census years, and so they will not show up on a census record. So that's why it's important that we search these records thoroughly. So here is the marriage record for Jesse Glasgow, who married Hannah Boyd, September the 2nd, 1835 in Davidson County, Tennessee. So I have that record. Court records. Many genealogists think to themselves, well, my ancestors were not criminals, so there shouldn't be any court records. There are a lot more court records than just criminal records. And this is a case in point. This is a record from 1892. That's in between the census. And in fact, with the 1890 census, the majority of it being destroyed, this is something that helps me with replacing that census record. This is actually a guardian bond. This is where Jesse Glasgow, January 21st, 1892, became the guardian of his grandchildren. His daughter, Mary, who was married to a Mr. Notley Harris, they both died and left his grandchildren without guardian. So in January of 1892, he became the guardian of his grandchildren. Interestingly enough, and you're going to see this, 2 months later, Jesse Glasgow will die, and his other son takes over his guardianship. So I get two things with this record. First of all, I get the documentation of Jesse Glasgow being the guardian. And then if you look where that red arrow is, I get his actual signature only 2 months before he dies. So two things I was able to get off of this record and something I can add to his timeline. School records. I was telling Katie before we started about some fantastic school records that we've gotten from our local school board for our archives. Just because you have an ancestor that didn't go to school, that doesn't mean there aren't school records for them. This is an actual receipt where Jesse Glasgow paid a subscription fee to the Cumberland City Academy, June the 15th, 1891. And it has been preserved and saved, and so we can do that. One thing about school records that I encourage genealogists is even if your ancestors didn't go to school or only went to school for a few years, still look in the school records, especially the school board minutes or any administrative records. Because as your ancestor aged and become an adult, maybe they drove the local school bus. Maybe they chopped wood for the one-room schoolhouse or delivered coal or worked on the roof, was a carpenter, things like that. And they'll be listed in school records. That's why we never discount any record. Here's an example of that. This is a school record from August the 30th, 1941, not for Jesse Glasgow, but a very important record. These were some records, a record that I found in some school administrative records we have in our archives. It says, please pay Conley Stringfield 4 days at $3 per day, $12 for building cabinets at the Stewart School, work on the home economic room. I can tell you unequivocally that Conley Stringfield did not go to school. He was a very good carpenter. and he built these cabinets. And the reason why I know he didn't go to school is because Conley Stringfield is my husband's grandfather. He died in 2001. I knew this gentleman very well. He was very accomplished. He was very educated, even though he didn't go to school. And he was a very good carpenter. And this record is in the school records. Now, this happened before my mother-in-law, his daughter, was born. And I was able to show her this receipt. She actually went to the Stewart School as a child. What she didn't know is that she didn't know that her father built the cabinets in the home economic room. And so when I showed her this receipt, it was very, very important to her, and it meant a lot to her. And so look for your ancestors in places where you don't think you'll find them, because you will be very surprised what you might find. So what does Jesse Glasgow's timeline look like now? I've shown you some records. Let's look at his timeline now. Look at that. It's growing. We have his marriage record from 1835. We've added that. We have that 1881 deed that I showed you, that receipt where he paid his taxes, 1885. The 1891 receipt where he paid one share in the Cumberland City Academy, and the 1892 appointment as guardian of his grandchildren. You know so much more about Jesse Glasgow now, and you can actually see it on paper or on the screen. I don't know about you, but even though I've done this research, it's becoming more and more interesting to me, and it makes me want to do more research and look at more records. So why look in an archive for records? So archives, libraries, historical societies, genealogical societies, those university archives and museums have records that are not online or even microfilmed. And don't let that deter you. There is a lot coming online these days. I can tell you that the digital records and digitizing records in any archive is becoming the thing to do. Many of our institutions, many of our governing bodies who are giving grant money or helping out archives are requiring these records to be digitized. So that's, yay for genealogists, but it's still not at a pace where they're going to get everything digitized. So we're still going to have to work with archives. So archives receive record donations from individuals all the time. I talk about manuscript collections all the time. I have a whole presentation on them, and I have genealogists that kind of look at me funny, like, what is that? This is an example of a manuscript collection. This is the Lyle family records that were donated to my archive. And if you look on this table, you'll see all kinds of different kinds of records. There's a ledger book, there's a scrapbook, there's photographs, there's newspaper clippings, there's receipts, there's invoices. All of this are unique, one-of-a-kind records that have not been microfilmed, have not been digitized, but are sitting in my archive. Another way I like to describe manuscript collections are, think about all the genealogical records that you have in your possession, that you have collected or that you've been inherited. Those scrapbooks, those diaries, grandma's quilt, your mother's wedding dress, a lock of hair maybe, those photographs, old family letters. Put all that stuff in boxes and carry it down to the local archive and donate it. That is a manuscript collection. So literally anything could be in those collections. So most archives understand the importance of historical and genealogical records. They're going to maintain their facilities and those collections, and they're going to store and preserve these records for us as researchers. Here is a photograph of the records vault where I work. This is the Houston County Archives and Museum. It looks a little bit better now. We don't have those records there in the aisleway, but this vault is in our courthouse in the basement. The courthouse was built in 1956, and they built this vault at that time. I love it. I've never seen a dead rodent or even a live bug in this thing, so I love it. But the reason I'm showing you this photograph is because if you look on the left, all of the books on the shelves, about 85% of those books are microfilmed, which is great, but the rest of them are not. And everything, all those boxes that you see, none of that is microfilmed and none of that is online. Now you may say, well, what are you doing, Melissa? Let's get busy and get this stuff digitized. It takes a lot of man hours to digitize every single piece of paper in these boxes. So it takes time. We work very hard at it and we get what we can online, but there's still going to be stuff you're going to have to look for. So to accomplish a reasonably exhaustive search, you're going to have to work with archives. They are a must to put on your to-do list. So what is reasonably exhaustive search? From evidence explained by Elizabeth Shawn Mills, a fellow Tennessean, from 2017, her book, This is defined as requiring thorough use of all known records relevant to the research problem and application of all appropriate methodology. I like to say it means you're never done. You need to keep searching and keep looking. Even if you come up empty, keep looking. One of these days, hopefully, records are going to surface that you need. So what's some unique records in an archive that you might want to access? Archives have unique records collections. And why are they unique? Because they were produced, developed by individuals, and all of us are unique. So they are striving to put as much as they can online, but again, vast amounts are still sitting in their archives. And so we're back to Jessie Glasgow again. This is a unique record. This is what we call ephemera. Ephemera is defined as a document or a piece of paper that was produced for a particular reason at a particular time. Once that reason or time is over, it normally gets thrown away, but it's saved. So we call that a piece of ephemera. And this is simply that. This is actually a post office receipt. Now, I don't know about you, but I get the opportunity sometimes to go to the post office to mail something, and I get a receipt. I probably don't save them. But this is from May 26th, 1883, where he mailed one letter to his son, George Washington Glasgow, at Cuba, Missouri. This receipt was done in Tennessee, but he was sending the letter to Cuba, Missouri. When I found this receipt, I immediately thought to myself, when did George Glasgow ever go to Cuba, Missouri? So it gave me a research lead. But the fact that this even survives is actually quite the miracle. So if we add that to his timeline, it makes his timeline and his life, his research, even more interesting. And I don't know about you, but when I start looking at the timeline, as I start able to fill in his timeline, it becomes even more interesting. It makes me want to do more research, gives me more ideas of where to look for records. I come up with more questions and all of that. And so it really gets me excited. Vertical files. These are a type of record in most archives. They're almost in every archive. Genealogists should be asking about these because they're not going to be in the little research area where you're sitting. They're probably going to be behind closed doors. There should be an index. You can ask the archivist about them. There should be an index, either an online index or a paper index there at the archive. They are a hodgepodge of records. They are usually arranged in filing cabinets, in file folders, and they're arranged by subject name or surname. So when you look at the index, it's very easy to find your surname. These are some miscellaneous records from the Hooper surname vertical file. Again, it could be anything in these vertical files. They're again arranged in file folders. They're labeled by surname or subject name. Here's a photograph from one of ours. And this is our AB file drawer. So you need to look at the index. These are going to be stored in the back rooms like I talked about. So ask the archivist, ask the Historical Society member, Genealogical Society member about them if they have them. Many times these are called family files or morgue files, research files, but they can be a treasure trove. They could have the piece of information you're looking for. This is a photograph of ours at our Archives and Museum, and I can tell you vertical files are a living thing. They grow. We now have 4 filing cabinets. So as things are donated or as we find things and want to add to our vertical files, they grow. And so this is an example of something I found for Jessie Glasgow, our target person, in a vertical file. This is an insurance stock policy from September the 19th, 1890. It's an original document. Yes, it's damaged, but it's an original document. What I love about this document is that when you read that down there, which you probably may not be able to read very well, it talks about how much coverage he has on his dwelling, which is $500, and it describes his dwelling. It's a 1-story framed shingle roof dwelling, and it goes on to talk about it. The next section is $100 on his personal property. All of us have homeowners, and so we know how this works. But it lists chairs and tables and things like that. This is a fantastic document to tell me more about Jessie Glasgow. He was well enough financially to afford an insurance policy. At this time, there was a lot of people who didn't have the money for an insurance policy. It's not like today where it was required that you had to have homeowners or car insurance. So it's very interesting. Manuscript collections. I just talked about manuscript collections, so I won't delve on those as much. They're personal papers, family papers, business records, things like that. Anything could be in a manuscript collection. I kind of think that manuscript collections are one of the most underused records collections genealogists just don't know about, or they're intimidated by. They're not sure how to navigate them. But they contain some of the most unique and wonderful records that you'll ever find. Here's an example of a processed manuscript collection. This is the Irish Celebration Records Collection here in Houston County. We have an Irish celebration every year in March. We've done it since 1963. So it's generated a lot of records, programs and newspaper clippings, photographs, things like that. So we've made a collection out of it. You may find that these, there's the finding aid, which we're going to talk about, is the roadmap. The finding aid is a document that the archivist will produce as they're processing the collection. And it's going to give you that box by box, folder by folder listing of what's in the collection. So that's why it's important to read the finding aids to see just what's in the collection. These again are not going to be out in the room where you're actually sitting. They're going to be in back rooms and vaults, but there should be an index of finding aids so that you can look at that. Here's another behind the scenes look of an archive. This is the Dickson County, Tennessee Archives. And I'm showing you this for two reasons, just to show you what it looks like behind the scenes, behind those doors, but also to show you that besides the books that are on the far wall, everything you see on these shelves are not online. They're not microfilmed. They're manuscript collections. There are finding aids that you can access online. You can research those finding aids, maybe find something that you're interested in, contact the archivist, ask them, can you scan and send me these records? We are always usually glad to do that, depending on how much you've requested. And so work with the archives, work with them about your research and what records they have. Here is a Joseph Glasgow record that I found in a manuscript collection. Again, another piece of ephemera, something that normally would not have been saved. This is from June 24th, 1889. This is where he's purchasing a subscription to a newspaper. So now I know he's literate. And I know he's reading the National Tribune. The National Tribune is a Washington, D.C. newspaper, and Joseph Glasgow lived his entire life in Tennessee. So it made me ask the question, how in the world did he pay for his subscription? It's amazing what you can do at the post office. You could go down to the post office and pay for a magazine subscription, a newspaper subscription. You could do anything at the post office back then. And so this is how he paid for his subscription was at the post office. So I have this documentation. Loose records are another type of record we should be working in. They are a collection of records that belong to a larger collection of bound volumes. Now, we're used to researching in those bound volumes, whether it's deed records or will books, things like that. They're bound, they're in book form. But many of these records have what are called loose records associated with them. These are working papers or associated papers with whatever's in the bound volume. Here's an example of that. This is the Circuit Court loose record. This is from 1952. This is State of Tennessee versus William Hughes. He was being charged of going armed. And as you can see, there's a little packet there, and all these documents were tri-folded and put into that packet. Well, I processed this particular document, and I pulled out all of the records, and I flattened them like a good archivist would do. But I felt like there was something still in there. So I reached down in there, and what was in there was the razor that he was going armed with. Quite the shock, quite the surprise, but a pleasant surprise. In the archives world, we love to find little things like this. And so now I have an artifact. But I can tell you that that blade is just as sharp today as it was back in 1952. But these records are not mentioned in the bound volumes. So if you find a court reference or a probate reference or a will or something like that in a bound volume, ask the archivist if they have loose records associated with it, because these are going to contain much more information. These are going to be the subpoenas, the affidavits, the witness statements, things like that, that are not in the bound volumes. They're organized and archived separately, obviously, from the bound volumes. They are additional documents and information that go with what's in the bound volume. So that tells you what you're reading in those bound volumes. It's not the whole story. So that's why we want to look for these loose records. So examples of records, bound volume records that might have loose records attached to them would be loose marriage records, loose court records, probate. Probate is probably the most popular one that genealogists know about. They can have a lot of extra paperwork associated with them. Here is one record that I found for Jesse Glasgow. This is his Civil War pension increase certificate from March the 3rd, 1883. And so he was part of an Illinois regiment, even though he lived in Tennessee. That took me a while as a young genealogist to figure out, well, did he go to Illinois and enlist because he lived in Tennessee his entire life? What I figured out, or what I found out, was that he lived very close to the Battle of Fort Donelson, which is only about 20 minutes from where I live. When the Illinois regiment was at Fort Donelson, that is when he enlisted. And so you have to think these things out. He actually enlisted when they were here in Tennessee. Scrapbooks. I love scrapbooks. People that know me know that I love to process them in the archives, but I also love to look at them, even if they have nothing to do with my ancestors. Scrapbooks are unique, very unique, because individuals put them together. They could have various documents, photographs, memorabilia about a person's life, local events, national events, and even written memories. They could have original documents pasted in them. I've seen that. Here's a photograph of some of the scrapbooks that we have in our archives. Again, this is not all of them, but I love scrapbooks. I could just sit and read one for an afternoon. They have documents that are rare, unique, and not often seen. So a great place to find those records that you can't find in any other record source. I actually found this in a scrapbook. This is Jesse Glasgow's Louisiana lottery ticket. I remember me talking about you could do anything at the post office. Well, this is one of those instances. This is dated June the 9th, 1888. Evidently, he purchased a Louisiana lottery ticket. Well, first of all, I didn't even know that they had lotteries back then. And so I did some research. It took me down a rabbit hole, of course. And the Louisiana lottery was operated by two ex-Civil War generals, General Beauregard and General Early. And it was a very controversial lottery. So if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, just Google Louisiana State Lottery 1888 and start reading. So Jesse Glasgow here, I found information in the local newspaper where you could go and purchase your Louisiana lottery ticket at the post office. So his lottery number there is at the bottom. They also publish the winning lottery numbers, and I have yet to find his as a winning lottery. So, but I know he played the lottery. So some scrapbooks have journaling, which is fantastic. If they paste things in there and then they write little notes about what it meant or what their memories were, that's also fun to find. One of my favorite scrapbooks is Evelyn Ellis's scrapbook. We have it in our archives. It was found in a home during an auction, and it's from the 1930s, but she pasted everything in her scrapbook. This is just an example of that. This is a Baby Ruth candy bar. Who would ever think to paste a Baby Ruth candy bar in a scrapbook? But she did. But then she journaled about it. She said, always remember June 11th, 1938 at Beech Grove at the ice cream supper. If this was your ancestor, wouldn't it be wonderful to find this little piece of a memory that you could add to your ancestors' timeline and to their story? Here's another example. This is an original Grand Ole Opry ticket from 1939. And again, she talks about going to the Grand Ole Opry. Very cool. Old letters, postcards, and diaries, great places to find information for your timeline or whatever method you're using to document your ancestors' lives. They can be a wealth of information, and all of our archives have them. They may have your ancestors' letters and diaries and scrapbooks there. They're personal records of our ancestors. They wrote things that many times they didn't think would be seen again, but they are. They're usually found in manuscript collections. That's normally how we archive them. They could be first-hand accounts of family history that you can't find anywhere else. Maybe there's a question in your family that you're trying to find proof for, and it's found in an old letter or a diary. So a great place to find that kind of information. You may also find birth, marriages, and deaths recorded in these sources when there were no birth records, marriage records, or death records available. So great thing to find. And I have something from Jesse Glasgow. This is a postcard that was sent to Jesse Glasgow from his daughter, my husband's ancestor, Almeda Ann Glasgow Bertram, dated June the 14th, 1886. Her spelling is atrocious, but it's a fantastic example of something that was sent to Jessie Glasgow. Also, this is the only known example of her handwriting that survives that we know of, and it has her signature. She's kind of talking about some mundane kind of legal things, but it's a one-of-a-kind thing and something that I was so glad to get as I did my research. Oh, we're back to Jessie Glasgow's timeline, and we've added these items. There's his Civil War pension increase, 1883. There's his postcard that I just showed you from his daughter, the Louisiana lottery ticket, and the subscription to the newspaper, and his home insurance. His timeline's getting bigger. And when you start looking at this timeline, he's getting more and more interesting, isn't he? So when you do these timelines for your ancestors, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised how they will come to life to you. So look for anything and everything. I actually use Google Books a lot. And so one day I was researching and I just looked for Jessie Glasgow in Google Books to find things. And I did find something that kind of surprised me. In a published work, and it's a very long title, the miscellaneous documents of the House of Representatives printed during the second session of the 39th Congress, 1866 to 1867, papers in the case of Dorsey B. Thomas versus Samuel M. Arnell. Whew, that's a long title. Essentially, what this was is that Mr. Thomas was suing Mr. Arnell during this particular election. Mr. Thomas said he won, and Mr. Arnell said that he won. Well, in the process of trying to figure this out, each of the voting districts had to report what the voting election results were. Well, I was shocked to see that Jessie Glasgow actually ran for the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, and he received 4 whole votes. So I never knew this. Nobody knew, but that tells me so much. It actually explains some other things that I had found. He was very political. And so I was able now then to go on to find some other things. But I just Googled him on Google Books. I add that to his timeline. And there it is, 1865, runs for U.S. House of Representatives. Now that really makes him interesting to me. It makes him really come to life to me, and he's just not some boring ancestor. So tell your ancestors' story. They deserve to have their story told. And if we don't do it, who's going to? Use archives in the areas where your ancestors lived. Look for any and all types of records. Look in records where you think, oh, they're probably not in here, but you may be surprised. Look for those school records like I talked about. Tell your ancestor story. Use methods to help them come to life to you and not be so boring. Because when they're not so boring, you'll want to do some research. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. Please visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives. You can also find me on Facebook. Just search for The Archive Lady. And if you have questions after we're through tonight, please send me an email. It's on the handout. It's also right here. I love getting email from those who have attended my presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Katie and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Well, thank you so much. A big round of applause. So many great resources and awesome stories that were shared, not only by you, but a few stories in the chat of cool things that people have found in archives. So, there's definitely also some people in the chat who've said things like, oh, I wish I knew an archivist like Melissa in my area of research, or I'm so intimidated by going to an archives. Like, what do I do? How do I start a conversation with an archivist if I don't know exactly what I'm looking for? So what suggestions do you have about people who might be a little shy about going to archives?
Well, I grew up very shy, so I understand that, and I understand being intimidated. The main thing is to not walk into an archive or send in that email that says, I want everything for the Smith family, because it's probably going to fall on deaf ears. Try to be as specific as you can with what you're looking for, whether that's you're looking for court records or probate records, death record, whatever you're looking for, try to be as specific. Give the archivist the information that you have. Don't make them do research that you've already done or send you records that you've already got. So, developing a relationship with a librarian, an archivist, a museum curator will help you to be not quite so shy or overwhelmed. And keep checking back often. Like I said, they get records donations almost on a daily basis. So if you check with them today, in 6 months, they could have received records and includes records that you were looking for.
Yeah, definitely. And I said in the chat too, like all the archivists I've met have been super nice, super helpful. So definitely don't feel intimidated or scared. I mean, every now and then you might get a bad one, who knows? But for the
There's
most
a bad
part,
apple in every barrel.
there's so many
Yep.
different archives, like Melissa talked about at the beginning. There's so many different archivists, so definitely, give it a shot. You see some of the examples that we've talked about today of all the amazing resources you can find about your ancestor. Isn't that worth it to get over your shyness or your uncomfortableness a little bit to find some more stories about your ancestors?
And I guarantee you, once you find that first record, you're going to be addicted to archives. So just get out there and start working with them.
Yeah, definitely. Someone had a question about Jesse. They were wondering, did you ever find out why he moved from Eastern North Carolina all the way to Tennessee?
His family, I believe his family came from there. And you also have to remember that in 1796, when Tennessee became a state, before that, the state of Tennessee was North Carolina. And so many times families that were in North Carolina when Tennessee became a state became Tennesseans, even though they didn't move an inch. So that happens. Researching how property lines, state lines, county lines sometimes will help you with your research.
All right. Someone's wondering, when you're requesting records from an archive, do you just send a request with different names listed and hope for the best? I know you kind of answered this a little bit in your first question.
Seriously, and many times we don't have a lot of information, but be as specific as you can. Only request records for one person and one record. I know you want everything and we want it now, and I get all that, but if you send too much, your email will probably be ignored. And I know that sounds horrible, but they get requests all day, every day, and they're going to work on the ones that are the easiest to work on. And so if you send them a request for this person for a marriage record, stop there, ask for that record and wait for the response, go through that, and then request something else. And be prepared, because many times archives ask for charges for copies, and sometimes they'll ask for, they'll charge you for research. If it's over 30 minutes or over an hour, a lot of times they'll give you that first part free. So always know what you're going to have to pay up front too.
Yeah. Someone asked, where would you start to look for deeds or tax records online?
I would go to Family Search, and I heard you say you were going to do a Family Search presentation, so I would encourage you to watch Katie's Family Search presentation. Don't use the search bar. Go to the catalog, search for, and what I search usually by state and then county, and many of those are digitized and online up to a certain point.
Yeah, remember, of course, not everything is online, but I have found some great collections on Family Search, as well as a few on Ancestry as well.
Yep. And a lot of times the local Register of Deeds or property office has digitized their records and put them on their county websites. So look there too.
Our next question, someone says they've saved many documents and information of their ancestors, but sadly none of their family is interested in continuing that research or saving it while they're gone. So what do? Do they just toss it out, or, should they maybe donate it to an archive?
Two things, actually. I encourage all genealogists to put their research online in some form or fashion. And I'm not advocating for any particular online tree. I'm just saying get it online somehow, some way. If you want to write a blog, if you want to use an online database, an online family tree, whatever. Because once it's online and you're gone, it will hopefully stay there. Secondly, I would encourage you to donate to an archive. However, there's some caveats to that, because our archives are getting full. A lot of our archives are full, and they all have guidelines that they follow on what they'll accept and what they won't accept. And at this point in time, they're not accepting, most of them are not accepting copies of records that you've copied off of an online database, such as census records or anything you've copied. Now, original family records, such as diaries, scrapbooks, old family letters, things like that, they would be interested in. And even some archives are really acceptable to receiving digitized records, because they can store those a lot better than they have a building for. Main thing is to talk to wherever it is you want to donate, find out what their collection policy is, and try to work with that. And so just, if you have originals, don't throw them away. Photographs, documents, things like that. Try to find a place for them.
Yeah.
And start now, even though you're living, start now, because if they're going to get thrown
Yes.
away by your children or grandchildren, start now.
Yeah, or reach out to one of those regional ones. Like somebody just posted in the chat, the Allen County Public Library, they,
Yes,
collect a ton from all around. So
they do.
someone's wondering where alien registration records would be stored. Are those usually in archives or?
Alien registration records, in my experience, and I'm just talking because I do a lot of my research is in the South, are usually at the county court clerk's office, and or at the state level. So that's where I would look.
Someone's wondering, how do you go about getting a library card outside of your region if you're looking for resources that only one offers? I know for Wisconsin, like if you live anywhere in Wisconsin, anybody can get a Wisconsin library card from any of our libraries. So it kind of depends on what area you're living in and what kind of the rules are in that area.
Yeah. In Tennessee, it's not like that, actually. And so this is happening during COVID. I could not go to my local library because my local library has Ancestry and some other databases, but they don't offer it. You can access it from home. And so I couldn't go to my library. So I started searching, and I started from where I live and moved outward, contacting libraries. And I actually found one in Tennessee that you had to pay. You had to pay a fee. And they were offering a special during COVID, I think, to get people to get library cards. And so I got a library card, and I'm able to access Ancestry and newspapers.com and Fold3 and things like that through their library database with my library card number. And I renew it every year. It's only $40 a year. And you think $40 a year, and I can access all these databases that are paid databases. I encourage everybody not only to get a local library card where you live, but get library cards wherever you can. You never know what kind of databases and things that they might have access to that you can access from home. You just have to keep going to these libraries and finding out which one offers that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Every library system is going to have their own different rules. Like some will have like a visitor card or an out of resident card or something like that. So some might be free, some might be paid for, but definitely inquire and search around to see what libraries have. Someone's wondering, if I plan to travel to a different state to go to an archive to do research, what's the best way to prepare for my research trip?
Ooh, that's a whole nother presentation in itself.
Right?
I actually encourage genealogists to, before you go, even like a month before you go, if you know you're going that far out in advance, talk to them, send them an email, let them know you're coming. For lots of different reasons. I always encourage genealogists to plan and make an appointment for a tour of the facility if they do that, because you get to see a lot of things in the back rooms. And this picture behind me is, I'm actually at home with the green screen, but this is a photograph from part of my archives where I work. So when people see this, they go, ooh, I want to go there. But you get to see what's in the back rooms. Pay attention to the labels on the box. What kind of records do they have? Also, contact them ahead of time. And if you have found some references on their website to certain records, when you get there, you might be pleasantly surprised to know that they have pulled those records for you and they're ready for you.
Yes.
And it'll save you some time.
Absolutely.
So plan ahead, work with them ahead of time, let them know you're coming. They will be very appreciative of that, because if you just show up on their doorstep, they're already working with probably researchers that are there. And if they've had the time to prepare for your visit, I think they'll be very much appreciative of that.
Yes, and then you can definitely maximize your research time too.
Yes.
And always be prepared. It's always going to take longer than you think.
Right.
You're going to want to go back about 10 times.
Absolutely. And when you get there and you've done your research, leave your contact information and get the contact information of a person there, an archivist. Because when you go back home, you'll have a person you can contact. They will have worked with you, and then you can continue that relationship.
Yeah. Someone's wondering, would a local museum accept donated family papers?
I think you'd have to talk to the museum. They all have their own policies on what they accept. I would think that if it was extremely locally historical, one of a kind, something that they would like to have in their museum to show the community as a whole, they would be interested in. As far as just copies of your genealogy research, probably not. But just talk to them, because everyone's different in what they'll accept.
Yeah, definitely. I think those were all of our questions we had, unless anybody else has another last minute one. Once again, thank you so much to Melissa for her amazing presentation. Lots of great resources. Again, don't forget all about the different archives there are and all the different resources all of them have. There are so many great opportunities to make your boring ancestors not boring.
That's right.
And definitely feel free to join us next month again on Thursday, July 13th at 6 p.m. Central. We're going to be talking about homestead records, so a really great land record if you're not familiar with homesteading. So there's a link to register for that in your handout. And then later in July on the 27th, I'm going to be doing a overview of Family Search where we're doing kind of a deep dive, a little tour of some of the really great resources and maybe some things you don't know about Family Search. So definitely feel free to join us for those. And once again, everyone have a great night and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.